You're listening to the For I Will Be With You podcast. For I Will Be With You. Daily reflections on recovery from the Bible.
Welcome back to the For I Will Be With You podcast for the 29th week of the year, from July 15th to July 21st, covering Leviticus 13:39 to Leviticus 16:7. So we are continuing with our discussion of tsaras, which is a disease that certain Israelites got in the wilderness. It's in some versions of the Bible, it's translated as leprosy. There's a lot of reasons to think that it wasn't actually leprosy, but rather a spiritual disease, a skin affliction that occurred for people who had done spiritually impure things like gossiping about other people. And as we mentioned previously, it was also possible to get tsaras in one's house. If you sort of poisoned your home, so to speak, with gossip and bad talk, your house could get tsaras, and it would afflict your walls, and you could see the like a rash kind of on your walls. This sounds obviously sort of strange, but that it's actually an interesting idea that I think holds true in practical terms. If you create toxicity, emotional and spiritual toxicity in your home, it is like your home is poisoned for the people who live there, like your family and yourself. So in Leviticus 13:39 it says, this is an explanation of how the priest will help cure tsaras of the house. It says, Leviticus 13:39 says, "The priest shall return on the seventh day. He shall look, and behold, the affliction had spread in the walls of the house. The priest shall command, and they shall remove the stones that contain the affliction, and they shall cast them outside the city onto a contaminated place." So what they're saying here is that if you have tsaras in your home, you would take the stones that were tainted out of your wall and throw them outside the city. So the meaning that if the affliction had spread, the priest comes back after 7 days to see if it has spread, and if it's spread, you take the stones out. Now, there's an interesting anecdote that goes with this, a collection of anecdotes, that when the Israelites took possession of the land of Canaan, some of the people moved into houses that had been vacated by the Canaanites. And the Canaanites, in certain cases, had left treasure hidden in the walls. And when the Israelites did this ritual of cleansing their house of tsaras and removing the stones, they found these treasures. And there's an interesting message in addiction recovery in this idea, which is that there's often a hidden reward for doing the hard work of recovery, and it almost follows the tsaras story directly. So, like, if you think about it like this, after acting out and getting afflicted with tsaras of the house, the Jew who has done slander and gossip must take action and physically remove the heavy stones that have the tsaras affliction. But by doing that work, there's the potential to discover treasure. And in recovery, we have the same opportunity. If we own up to our behavior and do the heavy lifting, so to speak, required to make a change in our life, which can seem like an endless, thankless task, there may be treasure hidden beneath our efforts, and that will be revealed to us. And I think that a lot of us have seen this in the rooms. People who do the work, they discover something of great value that they hadn't seen before, and that could be something, could actually be treasure. I certainly know people who've gotten very rich once they've gotten their act together in recovery, but it also can be something like a relationship with a parent or a child, or even just the treasure of having some serenity in your life. Those are all very valuable things, but they require work. They take removing the tainted stones, so to speak, from the walls that keep us from the outside world. Continuing now in Leviticus 16:1, which we're going to talk about on 3 separate ideas, it says, God spoke to Moses after the death of Aaron's 2 sons, when they approached before God and they died. So we've already discussed this incident. It happened in Leviticus 10, which is that Aaron, who was the high priest, had 4 sons. 2 of them, Nadab and Abihu, died when they brought what the Bible calls alien fire, an unauthorized offering to God in the sanctuary of the tabernacle. And this is one of these poorly understood incidents, tragic incident with multiple interpretations. But like a lot of poorly understood tragic things in the Bible, it's like a gateway to learning about ourselves in addiction recovery. Now here the incident is brought up again. And it's one thing that's important to remember about the 5 books of Moses is that they don't necessarily go in chronological order. They go in a generalized chronological order, meaning that if you're not aware of a inconsistency in the timeline, you can assume that things are happening in order, but there are certainly things brought up out of sequence. So what we have here really is sort of, this really should be Leviticus chapter 11, but it's happening in chapter 16. So and it's hard to understand why, but perhaps God wanted the Bible to digress into other topics before returning to this topic. So obviously, losing a child is a tremendous personal loss. And losing 2 sons on the same day for a mysterious reason would be, very hard to fathom, hard to understand the level of pain. Yet, what's happening here is that Aaron, who's the high priest, his faith in God and his resolve to fulfill his mission as the high priest never wavers. So in this great pain, Aaron still understands that the deaths are God's will. His commitment to faith in the face of personal pain is something that addicts can use for inspiration. For many of us, personal pain is a free pass for acting out. And it doesn't have to be. I personally know brothers and sisters in the rooms who have tragically had seen their children die. And at their higher powers were great enough to keep them solid in their path of recovery and not let these kind of tragedies give them an excuse to relapse. Because I think they knew that that was not a solution. It wouldn't bring their children back and it wouldn't make them feel better in any real way. Another way to look at this quote of Leviticus 1 where it says, God spoke to Moses after the death of Aaron's 2 sons when they approached before God and they died. So some commentators say that the reason Nadab and Abihu died is that they were drunk, literally drunk, and also drunk on the personal grandiosity to the point where they decided they could make up their own rules of ritual and disregard God's instructions for when and they should enter the tabernacle and when they should offer sacrifices. So that would be, I guess, the negative interpretation of their death. There's a completely opposite interpretation which comes up, which is that they were so holy and so perfect, that this act that they did was so perfect in spiritual terms that God decided that they had completed their mission on earth in life and called them back to heaven because they just reached the absolute pinnacle of their devotion. Now, either way, it's clear they acted on their own initiative when they brought this, quote, alien fire as an offering and died as a result. So we'll never know if their death was a punishment or a reward. So it's a perplexing situation in the Torah. Now, there's a similar issue that comes up in the program. And it happens like this. A lot of us decide that we know best, and we will work our own programs. We'll do a few steps, but not all of them. We'll go to some meetings, but not others. Maybe we won't go to meetings. We'll do our own special personal form of recovery. And here's the issue. Like this death of Nadab and Abihu, there is some benefit to personalizing your program. Because only you know you, right? And maybe if you work with a sponsor, he or she will identify things that you need to do that other people don't need to do. All right? Or maybe you need to add something to your program, like Bible study like we're doing here, or exercise or whatever. But there's a huge risk to going outside the program. And I hope no one ever interprets anything I say in this series or in my books that you should not do the full program and work the steps thoroughly. And seeking your own way in sobriety, especially early on, is really a recipe for disaster. And this is one of the lessons we can learn from the death of Nadab and Abihu. So a third look at this same quote, where it says, God spoke to Moses after the death of Aaron's two sons, when they approached before God and they died. Okay, so the language here is curious. So the question that comes up, why does the Bible repeat itself? It already says God spoke to Moses after the deaths, so we know they're dead. Okay, so why does this verse end with the words, and they died? So one way to look at it, this seemingly redundant phrase, and as we know now, the Torah has no redundant phrases in it. It's almost always a signal for further interpretation. So in this case, the Kabbalah, the Zohar, the book of Jewish mysticism, suggests that there were actually two deaths for each man. There was a physical death of each man, and then there was the death of any children they might have had. So that's maybe what it means, and they died. So you could actually look at it, the sentence like this: after the death of these two men, they, meaning their children, died. And I think that this is a concept we can work with in recovery, difficult as it is, as sad as it is. That addiction, it doesn't just harm us, it harms other people in our lives. It might even kill other people in our lives. We've certainly seen that a few times with car accidents and other things like that. So we're actually dying twice in a way. If we let our addiction kill us, or kill us spiritually, if we let addiction lead us into a spiritually dead life, then we might be killing our families at the same time, or those close to us. And it's a sad idea, but it's important. On the other hand, the other opposite is also true. There's a potential for tremendous resurgence in life, in ourselves and in our families, if we get sober. But this is a concept we can work with, for better or worse. It's when we die, our children, our unborn children, also die. Leviticus 16:2 says, "And God said to Moses, Speak to Aaron, your brother. He shall not come at all times into the sanctuary within the curtain, in front of the cover that is upon the ark, so that he should not die. For in a cloud will I appear upon the ark cover." Now, what the Bible is describing here is a Jewish ritual holiday known as Yom Kippur, which most of people have probably heard of. Yom Kippur is one of the so-called high holy days of the Jewish religion. It's the day of atonement. It's the day that God wrote into the Torah that the Israelites should atone for their sins. And there is a very special, elaborate, and unique ritual that the high priest does on Yom Kippur. In fact, it's the only day of the year when there was a temple and a tabernacle. It was the only day of the year when the high priest could actually enter the innermost space of the temple, or of the tabernacle, which was called the Holy of Holies. So you might have heard that phrase, the Holy of Holies. You might not have realized it actually refers to a specific place. There was a room basically inside the temple, and there was the same room inside the tabernacle, just a smaller scale, and it was protected by a curtain, and it was against biblical law for the high priest to enter that space except on Yom Kippur, and except in a very specific way. And it relates back to the deaths of Aaron's two sons, that they violated this rule, and that's one of the reasons they died. So a question comes up from the commentary, why is the Bible putting these two things next to each other? There's always when two things come next to each other in the Bible, it's always a good idea to ask why. Why is the Yom Kippur service, the atonement of the Israelite nation, coming right after the next verse after this reference to the deaths of Aaron's two sons? So the one interpretation is these two things must be connected in some way. So the connection could be taken from the Talmud, which is the book of Jewish law, that the deaths of the righteous bring atonement. Okay, when a righteous person dies, it brings atonement to the Israelite nation. In the same way that the Yom Kippur prayers and rituals bring atonement. Another further interpretation, Talmud says that when the righteous go to heaven, the other righteous ones who are already there rejoice. So when the righteous in heaven rejoice, the sort of a special spiritual energy comes back at us here on earth and helps bring atonement to us. And this is an idea that comes up in Bible, in interpretation of Bible, which is that there's things that happen in the heavenly realm that mirror what's happening in the earthly realm. So that when people are happy in heaven, it brings happiness to earth and so forth. Or when we do something good, spiritually good on earth, it brings spiritual happiness to heaven and so forth. It's kind of abstract. It's kind of abstract idea, but it's an interesting concept that I've personally experienced this in recovery, and it's mysterious to me, but I've experienced it when somehow you do something positive in program or whatever, and then a spiritual reward sort of finds you. I've had this experience, and I believe comes from this exchange of energies between heaven and earth. Obviously, it's very abstract, and not everybody believes that, but that's just something to think about. In the same way, in the rooms, we have righteous people in the rooms. Sometimes they're hard to spot because they keep quiet, but they have great recovery, and they're very righteous, and then we lose them eventually. They go into the next world, and maybe when they go to the next world, in the same way that the deaths of the righteous in the Bible brings rejoicing in heaven that comes back to earth, maybe their energy is coming back to us as well. So next time you feel something really good happening in your life, maybe that's what it is. It's the energy of a righteous brother or sister from the rooms who's passed on to the next world. Their energy is coming back at you. Leviticus 16:4 says, he, meaning the high priest Aaron, he shall don a sacred linen tunic. Linen breeches shall be upon his flesh. He shall gird himself with a linen sash, and cover his head with a linen turban. They are sacred vestments. He shall immerse himself in water and then don them. So this is more description of the high priest's preparation for ritual on the Yom Kippur day. So he's got to go through this. You don't just walk into the Holy of Holies. You have to bathe. You have to go into a ritual bath and put on special clothes. And there's an implied warning here, as the deaths of Nadab and Abihu suggest, which is if you do this wrong, you're going to die. And I know that sounds kind of heavy-handed, but there's an important lesson in it, which is that when you're going to go into this zone of such a high spiritual state, you have to prepare yourself. You cannot go half-cocked. You can't be dirty or unkempt in physically or spiritually. It takes concentration. So recovery is really sort of the same, in the sense here the priest is immersing himself in a special bath to purify himself. And I think that we can use this concept of immersion in our own programs. If we want to achieve serenity and move our lives forward as sober people, we need to immerse ourselves in the program. Immerse like a cleansing bath. Okay? Now, what does that mean, to immerse ourselves in the program? I would think of it like this. Maybe it could mean having a really regular structure of our lives around recovery with meetings and social circle of sober friends, sort of immersing yourself in sober people. Or it could mean we're concentrating on recovery 100% at certain times of day, like almost like you're just dipping yourself in it a couple times a day. Most of us can't do it all day, right? But maybe, like, for example, morning and night, you absolutely immerse yourself in recovery mentally to get yourself sort of clean, so to speak, and back and ready for the day. Leviticus 16:7 to 16:10 says, He, Aaron, shall take the 2 he-goats and stand them before God at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Aaron shall place lots upon the 2 he-goats, one for God and one lot for Azazel. Aaron shall bring near the he-goat designated by lot for God and make it a sin offering. And the he-goat designated by lot for Azazel should be stood alive before God to provide atonement through it, to send it to Azazel to the wilderness. Okay, so there's a lot there, and I will explain. And if this sounds a little bit familiar, there's a reason. There's a phrase we have in English called the scapegoat, which, like a lot of English phrases that come from the Bible, the actual origin of it has been largely forgotten. What's happening here is that as part of the Yom Kippur service, as part of the ritual that the high priest does to bring atonement for the Israelite nation, this was done at the times of the tabernacle and when the temple was in Jerusalem, the high priest would take 2 goats and he would sort of take lots, like draw straws, so to speak, and randomly choose based on the lots that were drawn. One goat was sacrificed on the altar as a sin offering, and the other was sent out into the wilderness, and where it would go off a cliff or something and it would die. So the goat that was sent to Azazel, this is the so-called scapegoat, and it's the goat onto which the idea is that the priest is sort of transferring the sins of the Israelites onto the goat, and the goat is sent out into the wilderness. And that's where the concept of the scapegoat comes from. Now, of course, unfortunately, the concept of scapegoat has a very negative connotation in modern language. It's come to mean that someone's an object of prejudice. But in the biblical sense, it means something a little bit different, which is that the goat is a transfer mechanism for sin, and it's to remind us that we are the ones who should be sent out to the wilderness to die. But somehow we are fortunate enough, because God has mercy on us, that He is giving us a chance to atone, and the goat will take our sins away for us. And this, to me, relates to the concept in recovery known as turning it over. Turn it over to God. What should we do with our feelings of craving, our negative feelings, our toxic feelings of addiction, and things that trigger us to want to act out and be addicts and alcoholics? The program says turn them over to God and let God sort them out for us. And I will tell you, and I don't think I'm the only person who had this experience, I found this a very odd process when I started doing it. It certainly didn't align with any sense I had of what God was all about, but I thought, well, I'm going to try it because, like a lot of people in the program, I'd really run out of alternatives, and I was willing to try anything if it would get me out of the life I was living. Okay? So God understands what to do with destructive, toxic feelings, even if we can't handle them. We should turn them over. Let God handle them. In the same way that the priest would put the sins onto the goat designated for Azazel. And once the goat was sent away, carrying the sins, the Israelites could atone for their sins. And so can we get ready to atone for our bad behavior and get ready to resume a sober life.
You've been listening to the For I Will Be With You podcast. Daily reflections on recovery from the Bible. www.foriwillbewithyou.com